picture this. It's pouring rain in Otoxeter, England.
Okay.
And standing there, totally soaked, is Samuel Johnson, a literary giant, from the 18th century.
Right.
But he's not just, waiting for the rain to stop. He's standing bareheaded.
Oh, wow.
As an act of penance.
Really?
Yeah, on the very spot where he once refused to help his dad at his market stall.
Huh.
Like, decades later, this is how he, chose to deal with his guilt.
That's intense.
It's heavy stuff.
Yeah.
Really makes you think about the mind, behind some of the, most iconic works in English literature.
Yeah, it's a powerful image. It speaks to a real, profound sense of guilt, maybe even a feeling of, not being worthy, even after all his success. It makes you wonder, where did this brilliance come from? Could it be, connected to his struggles?
Welcome to the Mad Genius Thesis.
Yes.
Where we explore the fascinating and often complicated relationship between creativity and mental illness. Today, we're doing a deep dive into the life of Samuel Johnson. This literary titan who battled with what he called vile melancholy his whole life.
That term vile melancholy is so important. It wasn't just, sadness for Johnson. We have to remember that back then, in the 18th century, melancholy was a recognized medical condition, like a serious imbalance that could even lead to madness. The line between the two was super blurry.
And Johnson seemed to get that. In his own dictionary, he defines melancholy as a kind of madness, which is kind of, striking.
Yeah, he didn't shy away from it at all. And it wasn't only mental stuff he was dealing with. Johnson had a lot of physical problems, too. Blind in one eye, deaf in one ear, smallpox scars, and then you have those convulsive tics that people always talked about. It's like his own body was working against him.
It's almost impossible to imagine dealing with all that. No wonder his friend, Frances Reynolds, described his melancholy as terrifying.
Yeah.
She even mentioned that he was, scared of going insane.
Totally. And then there's also the fact that his dad also suffered from a similar, melancholy. It's like Johnson felt this inherited burden, almost like he was destined for darkness.
Wow, that's a lot to carry. It makes you think about how all of this played into his path to becoming a literary icon.
Yeah.
Let's go back a bit to his early days. Johnson's story starts in Litchfield.
Okay.
A town known for its rough and tumble energy.
Yeah.
Not exactly a gentle place for a sensitive soul.
You're right. Litchfield had this really boisterous, almost unruly atmosphere, and you actually see that in Johnson's personality, his quick wit, his booming voice, that tendency to dominate conversations. That all shows this kind of vibrancy he had.
He definitely wasn't one to sit quietly in the corner.
No, not at all.
But there's this story from when he was a kid that shows a different side. Johnson was so poor that his shoes were literally falling apart. And when someone left a new pair on his doorstep, he was so offended that he threw them back down the stairs.
Yeah, that's that fierce pride of his. Even when things were tough, he wouldn't accept charity. He wanted to succeed on his own terms. What's interesting is that all those early experiences, with poverty, depression, the struggle to find work, they all became themes in his writing later on.
So in a way, those struggles in Litchfield, planted the seeds for his literary genius. He was using his life, his own pain, to create something powerful and relatable.
Exactly. And those struggles, they didn't just disappear when he got to London. Imagine 18th century London. Crowds, noise, filth.
Don't forget about the heads of traders on display.
Oh!
Not the warmest welcome.
Pretty grim. But here's what's surprising. Amidst all that chaos, Johnson developed this deep compassion for, the people struggling. Beggars, those imprisoned for debt, kids forced into dangerous work. He saw their suffering, and he became a voice for them.
He had this way of using his wit to get his point across. He once said that giving money to beggars just lets them keep begging. Sounds harsh, but then he explains that, why should they be denied such sweeteners of their existence?
Yeah, it shows that he understood that even small pleasures mattered, especially for those struggling. That's a perspective that's, relevant even today. His experiences in London, with all its inequalities, definitely shaped his social conscience, and we see that in his writing.
For all his, gruffness, Johnson had a remarkably sharp mind. He always needed to be thinking, talking, debating. It's like his mind never rested. He could write poems in a single morning and just churn out essays under pressure.
His mental stamina was incredible, and his memory, he could process information so fast. But he was also full of contradictions. He had these odd habits, those convulsive tics, and his, demeanor could go from gruff to charming in a second.
Here's something that always makes me laugh. His friend, Hester Thrale, said that even though he had that gruff exterior, Johnson actually thought he was impeccably well-mannered.
It makes you wonder what well-mannered meant to him, but it also shows how self-aware he was, or maybe, how he wasn't.
He was a real paradox.
Mm-hmm.
And that's part of what makes him so interesting.
Definitely. And despite all his brilliance and, his eccentricities, he really craved connection. He was terrified of being alone and needed to be around other people.
It's funny because with that reputation for being grumpy and argumentative, you'd think he'd prefer to be alone. But his circle of friends was so diverse. Rakes, artists, even politicians he totally disagreed with.
Yeah, it makes you wonder what he was looking for in those friendships. Intellectual stimulation, emotional support, a sense of belonging, maybe all of it.
It's like he needed that constant back and forth, that clash of ideas to feel alive.
One of the most important relationships in his life was with Hester Thrale, his patron and confidant. She gave him stability, intellectual companionship, and that feeling of family he'd always wanted.
And then she goes and remarries. And not just to anyone, but to an Italian musician. Johnson was completely devastated. He even wrote her this heartbreaking letter begging her not to forget him, describing himself as radically wretched without her. You can really feel his despair.
It's a reminder that even the most brilliant minds need connection and love. That heartbreak must have really impacted him, especially later in his life.
It adds another layer to his, complicated relationship with his own mind.
Absolutely. And it brings us back to that central question. Did Johnson's genius come from his suffering, or did it grow despite it?
It's a question that keeps fascinating us as we look deeper into the life and works of this literary giant.
So we've talked about, Johnson's struggles with his vile melancholy, but we can't forget just how powerful his mind was.
Yeah.
Despite everything he went through, he created this amazing body of work.
It's really incredible. His constant need to be thinking, talking, debating. Like his mind was always going.
Right.
But was that like a strength or was it more like a symptom of all that inner turmoil?
That's a question that keeps scholars up at night. Was his melancholy the, driving force behind his creativity, or was it something he constantly had to fight against?
To get closer to an answer, we could take a look at some of his work.
Okay.
We know he was incredibly prolific. He was always writing essays, poems, even ghostwriting sermons for friends who weren't feeling quite so inspired.
Yeah, speaking of churning things out, let's talk about his dictionary.
Okay.
Creating a whole dictionary all by himself. Back then, it's mind-boggling.
It's a real testament to his intellect and ambition.
Right.
Remember, he wasn't just listing words.
Yeah.
He was trying to define what the English language actually was.
Yeah.
To make sense of a system he saw as, chaotic and always changing.
Yeah, he even said he wanted to fix the meanings of words.
Yeah.
Which seems impossible even now.
It really does.
Yeah.
It speaks to his need for control, for clarity. Maybe it was his way of, pushing back against the chaos he felt inside. But even he had to admit that language, it's alive, it's always evolving.
He couldn't embalm it, as he put it. That realization must have been tough after spending years on the project.
Oh, yeah, it put things in perspective for sure. But even if the dictionary didn't accomplish everything he wanted it to, it really solidified his reputation as a literary giant.
Absolutely. It shows his intellectual stamina and, his sheer will. But to really understand Johnson, I think we need to look at his poetry, particularly The Vanity of Human Wishes.
That's the one that basically says all our ambitions and desires are pointless, right?
Right. Not exactly a pick-me-up,
Wow.
but what makes The Vanity of Human Wishes so interesting is that it's not just some, detached philosophical idea. It's deeply personal. It's filled with Johnson's own experiences with loss, disappointment, and that ever-present fear of madness.
There are those lines that are so powerful, like year chases year, decay pursues decay.
Yeah.
About how we're always losing the things that bring us joy. You can almost hear his own melancholy in those words.
Exactly. He's not just watching human nature from afar. He's writing from his own experiences, his own struggle to find meaning in a world that can feel so indifferent and cruel.
So we have the dictionary, which shows us his intellect and ambition, and then the vanity of human wishes, which gives us a glimpse of his, darker side.
Yeah.
What about his plays, specifically Irene, which, to be honest, wasn't exactly a smash hit?
Irene isn't considered one of his best, that's true.
Right.
But it's still important because it tells us something about how he created and maybe, where he struggled.
It's almost as if he was so brilliant with language, so insightful about people, but when it came to writing a captivating play, he just couldn't quite pull it off.
He was trying to stick to the rules of classical tragedy, which can stifle creativity. The play has lots of long speeches and philosophical ideas, but it doesn't have the emotional depth or the dramatic tension to make it truly engaging.
It's like his own intellect got in the way.
Maybe. And there's an interesting story about that. His friend David Garrick, the famous actor and theater manager, tried to make Irene more exciting.
Oh, really?
Yeah, by adding some theatrical elements.
What did Johnson think about that?
He was not happy.
Big ear
He
shoes?
thought Garrick was showing off instead of actually making the play better.
That's so Johnson. But at least he stuck to his need to control his work, even if it meant missing out on some, dramatic flair.
Exactly. And this idea of control takes us to one of Johnson's biggest struggles, his own imagination. He saw it as this powerful force that could lead to madness if it wasn't kept in check by reason.
He even said, all power of fancy over reason is a degree of insanity. That's a strong statement, coming from someone who really lived by his words. He was almost afraid of his own creativity.
And remember, this is a man who knew mental illness firsthand, both through his own experiences and his father's role. For Johnson, that line between imagination and madness was very real.
So then the question is, did he manage to, harness his imagination and put it into his writing, or was it a constant source of anxiety for him?
Yeah, that's a great question. And if we look closely at his work, we see both. He had this amazing ability to create vivid characters and build whole worlds with his words.
Like in Rasselas, his philosophical novel set in Abyssinia.
Oh, yeah.
It's about searching for happiness, but it's also about the limits of what we can know and how imagination can both inspire and trick us.
Exactly. And then you have his essays, like the ones in The Rambler, where he talks about all sorts of complicated topics with wit and insight.
Right.
They show a mind that's really engaging with the world, a mind that's not afraid to tackle big ideas.
But then there are times when his imagination seems to take over.
Yeah.
His fear of death, his focus on his own sinfulness, his tendency to see the world as a dark and dangerous place, it all points to a mind struggling with, darker things.
And those darker impulses, those anxieties, they definitely made their way into his writing, too. Think about how bleak The Vanity of Human Wishes is, or the tormented characters in some of his lesser-known work.
It seems like he was always walking this line between brilliance and madness, between the power of his imagination and the fear of losing control.
That's a great way to put it. And maybe that's why his work is still so powerful, so relatable centuries later. He speaks to our own struggles to understand the world and find meaning in our lives.
Yeah.
He captures those moments of darkness and doubt that we all feel, but often try to hide.
It's like his vulnerability makes him even more human, even more relatable, despite all his genius.
Exactly. And it's a good reminder that even the most brilliant minds struggle with the same fears and anxieties that we all do. Genius doesn't shield you from suffering, and for Johnson, it might have even made it stronger.
Now that we've explored some of his major works, I want to learn more about his personal life. In the next part of our deep dive, let's dig into his relationships and how they might have shaped his creative path. It's amazing how Johnson got so much done with all the stuff he was dealing with.
Right.
He was always fighting those physical and mental things, but he never really seemed to stop working.
Yeah, what's remarkable is that his struggles seem to have, made him more empathetic, more understanding of what it means to be human. We talked about his compassion for the poor in London, but that empathy extended to everyone around him, too.
That's true. His own household was this, fascinating mix of people who depended on him.
Oh, yeah. It was a really eclectic bunch. You had Anna Williams, the blind poet, Francis Barber, the freed slave he took in, and Robert Levet, the eccentric doctor.
Right.
And then all the struggling writers and artists he mentored and helped. It was like he created the safe space for, the misfits and the outcasts. He got their struggles because he lived them himself.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And you see that in his writing, his ability to show characters from all walks of life with real depth and compassion.
Yeah.
It's like his own suffering made him more aware of the suffering of others.
It's true.
Speaking of suffering, there's one thing about Johnson's life that I've always found disturbing.
Mm-hmm.
Can we talk about that whole chains and whips thing?
Oh.
It's hard to reconcile that with the witty intellectual person we've been talking about.
It's definitely one of the most controversial things about him. Hester Thrale, his closest friend, she revealed that he'd ask her to restrain him with chains.
Wow.
Even to whip him as a way to control his impulses, his fear of going mad.
It's like hard to imagine what would push him to do that.
I know.
What do you think was behind those impulses?
Well, some scholars think it was his struggle with sexual desires. Others say it was his anger or a fear of violence. It was probably a mix of things. Whatever it was, he clearly felt like he needed to take extreme measures to, keep it under control.
It's a dark and kind of unsettling glimpse into his mind.
Yeah.
But it also shows how much he struggled, how badly he wanted relief. It makes his achievements even more impressive.
Absolutely.
And speaking of achievements, we can't forget James Boswell, Johnson's most famous biographer.
Oh, right.
He really shaped how we see Johnson today.
Boswell, the ultimate fanboy.
Or he followed Johnson everywhere, writing down everything he said and did.
Right.
And we're lucky he did. Without Boswell's notes, we wouldn't have such a rich and detailed picture of Johnson.
He was like a human tape recorder, capturing all of Johnson's wit, his wisdom, even his outbursts.
Yeah, and he didn't try to hide Johnson's flaws and contradictions.
Yeah.
He shows us the whole picture, good and bad. That's what makes his biography so fascinating.
And it wasn't just about worshiping him, right?
Wow.
They genuinely enjoyed being around each other, spending hours just talking about everything.
They had a real intellectual connection, even though they were very different people. Johnson, the older, more experienced scholar, and Boswell, the younger, more impulsive admirer.
It sounds like the perfect combination for some, really memorable conversations.
And those conversations are what make Boswell's biography so captivating. You feel like you're right there with them, listening to Johnson talk about all sorts of things.
So after this deep dive into his life and work, what do you think about the question we started with? Was Samuel Johnson a mad genius?
Well, I think we can safely say he was a genius.
And he definitely had those periods of melancholy, maybe even what we'd call clinical depression today.
Right.
But to just call him mad wouldn't do him justice.
He was a man of his time,
Yeah.
living in a world where sanity and madness weren't always so clear.
Right.
And his creativity, his ability to capture what it means to be human, it seems tied to his personal struggles.
Exactly. And maybe that's the biggest takeaway from exploring Johnson's life. Being a genius doesn't mean you don't suffer. In fact, it might make you even more sensitive to it. And it's often in that space, that tension between brilliance and vulnerability, where the most powerful and lasting art comes from.
That's a really thought-provoking point. So listeners, as we wrap up our deep dive into the world of Samuel Johnson, we'll leave you with this. Was his need to control his imagination, which he thought was so important, the key to his genius? Or did he maybe pay a price for holding back so much of himself? We encourage you to explore his work, especially The Vanity of Human Wishes and Rasselas, and decide for yourselves about this complex and fascinating man.
And as we continue exploring this idea of the mad genius, we'll be looking at other captivating figures, each with their own unique story. So join us next time for another journey into the connection between creativity and the human mind.
Thanks for listening to the Mad Genius Thesis. Stay curious, and we'll see you next time.